Everything I touch turns to shade. Everything I touch turns to shade, oh yeah. Everything I touch turns to shade, and you don't care.
Netflix's series Adolescence has taken the internet by storm, sparking a hurricane of think pieces, Twitter threads, and furious Reddit debates, and so many bad TikToks. With my typical ruthless instinct for timing, here's my lukewarm take on all of this. The UK in particular has seen calls for the show to be screened in schools, with supporters of this idea claiming that it's a vital, unflinching look at modern gender dynamics and the pressures that young people face. Critics, however, and I would count myself amongst them, argue that it demonizes men, fuels a divisive narrative, and paints boys as ticking time bombs of misogyny, which seems unfair and feels like the series is contributing to the problem, not making it any better. As always, depressingly always, the discourse has spiraled into a mess of buzzwords, bad faith arguments, and political opportunism. Today I'm going to sift through this wreckage, try to define some of the key terms being thrown around, and to get to the heart of why discussions around men and masculinity are so fucking toxic and useless and seemingly stuck in 2014. So, let's start with some definitions, because contrary to popular belief, semantics are actually important, so we understand what each other means by various terms. The term manosphere gets used like it's some nefarious underground cult of misogynists, but all it really means is content aimed at men. That would include everyone from self-help gurus to fitness influencers to, yeah, sure, genuine actual misogynists, but also to just men talking about men's issues. It even includes all the men talking about narratives and ways of being as a man that go against what is typically considered manospheric. Manospherical is when you have more of a dad bod and a one-pack or a keg. But yeah, manosphere just means related to men. Then there's incel. Originally coined by a woman in the 1990s, it simply meant involuntary celibate, hence in-cel. It was a self-adopted label for people who struggled with dating and relationships. Over time, it has been hijacked and redefined to mean dangerous radical misogynist with little regard for accuracy, history, or nuance. Most people have at some point in their lives experienced sexual or romantic loneliness and the loss of self-worth that comes with it. Such sexual and romantic loneliness can be catastrophic for our self-esteem and mental health. To me, that would suggest that the problem needs to be addressed in some way. I don't know how. To others, it just seems to result in more alienation and bullying, akin to the bullying you may have gotten for being a virgin while at school. But it's interesting, isn't it? Many of the people who resist the redefinition in popular usage of terms like woke to meaning a busybody church lady, from meaning aware and awake to injustice, they will hold tight, white-knuckled onto the original definition of woke, but they want all these other words and definitions to conform to how they want to redefine them. It's all rather hypocritical, and that's a bit of a theme here. This all ties into a broader cultural shift where masculinity itself is increasingly framed as a problem rather than a mere state of existence. not as a result of any particular negative expression of masculinity, but just as a thing in itself. The rise of revenge feminism, exemplified by phrases like kill all men and a sort of secular original sin idea, taps into deep-seated anger at so-called male violence and oppression historically, but often spills over into something more disturbing, a collective guilt imposed on all men, which is then used to excuse, hypocritically, extremely caustic sexism aimed at men, and even racism into the mix as well, with white men being seen as a particular good target for this kind of prejudice and abuse. Again, the hypocrisy is palpable, and it rather undermines any supposed message of equality which used to be the central strut of feminism, and undermines the idea that sexism itself is inherently bad, free of context. Young boys who have done nothing wrong yet are being raised in an environment that tells them that they're inherently dangerous, automatically wrong, inherently worthless, and can never ever do anything about that. That they must atone for the sins of men who lived centuries ago by immiserating and flagellating themselves, but also that this will never ever be enough. If they express frustration at the unfairness of this or the double standard, they're called entitled. If they struggle with it, they're told to man up, even by the people who are trying to criticize masculinity. If they ask for help, they are ignored or ridiculed, or it simply isn't available. And if they check out entirely and end up isolated and alone, well, that's their fault as well. 3/4 of the homeless are men, but the focus in society largely remains on that 1/4 that are women. There are virtually no domestic violence shelters for men, despite men getting on for half of all victims, and probably getting to half of all victims if we could get people to answer honestly. Men's mental health support is typically unsuitable and also hard to access. And so it goes on throughout society, one thing after another. The discourse around adolescence plays directly into this trend, painting male suffering as either deserved or irrelevant, and in many ways blaming the victim of alienation and predation for their own alienation and being predated upon. And this happens in a way that we rarely see applied to the fairer sex. It demands that men recognize female pain, but refuses to acknowledge male pain in return. There is no reciprocity, there is no balance. It refuses to acknowledge the forces that men and boys are left to the mercy of when we abandon or alienate them. And that pain that they feel is very real. Men face higher rates of suicide, homelessness, and workplace deaths. They work themselves to death. They're often isolated from friends and companions. Men receive longer prison sentences for the same crimes in the same circumstances as women, and are often treated unfairly in divorce and custody cases, but that's more complex than either side seems willing to discuss. Men are vastly underrepresented in healthcare research and funding, despite being overrepresented in the people that medical experiments and so on are done on. Male teachers and role models are barely present in primary education, and the atmosphere is toxic and suspicious of any man that does want to work in that arena. In more advanced education, men are barely present in the humanities. Anyone who could be a male role model is either resiliently toxic and immune to the slings and arrows of popular discourse, or flawed, as all people are, and therefore acquiescent enough to be torn down by those same forces. Meanwhile, around every corner lurk predatory groups that are there trying to exploit these alienated and often quite justifiably angry men. Dating apps exploit lonely men for profit, feeding them false hope via bots and fake profiles while draining their wallets in a way women on the self-same apps will never know about unless they pretend to be a man on them. Right-wing groups prey on disenfranchised young men, offering them a twisted form of belonging and a return to traditional masculinity of a tradition that never really existed. Self-help grifters like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson sell them a vision of masculinity that's half cult, half pyramid scheme, pseudo-intellectual at best, and all scam. Meanwhile, the left, the people who should be advocating for equality and seeking to invest in our men and boys to bring them up in par with everybody else, barely engage with these young men. Instead, they alienate them, they mock them, they tell them that their pain isn't real or that they deserve it for the sins of the past. They turn their backs on equality when it comes to men, boys, and masculinity, and then wonder why young men turn elsewhere. If you want to know why men and women are increasingly politically divergent, then there's your answer. Only one side is consistent, even if that's consistently horrible, and is even attempting to talk to men, or at least expressing some of their frustrations. That's frustrating to me because this horrible monster that wears the left as a skin suit is espousing identitarian beliefs that are antithetical to left-wing thought. It's not dissimilar to how the working class has in many places around the world been hijacked by the right and the far right, not because they particularly have anything to offer the working class, but because they're the only ones that are engaging and talking with them and giving them something to blame, if not something to strive for. Part of the problem here is that masculinity itself has never been properly reconstructed or opened up in the way femininity has. Feminism successfully redefined womanhood into basically being whatever you wanted it to be, expanding it beyond rigid domestic roles. Women can be soldiers, warriors, scientists, caregivers, or anything in between. They can even do pornography these days and have it be seen as a positive and empowering role, which is something I would actually agree with. But masculinity, on the other hand, remains stubbornly stuck. Society took a sledgehammer to the traditional provider and protector archetypes, which was somewhat mixed in their value, but it never built anything in its place. It never allowed men to be anything different, and even the women who decry masculinity for various reasons seem to have a double standard when it comes to all this. Young men are left with bad choices: either conform to a toxic, outdated, pseudo-traditionalistic model of masculinity, or abandon any pride, any healthy expression of ego, any masculinity or confidence at all, and endure endless abuse from hypocritical abusers and just keep your head down. Most men don't necessarily want to do either, but other than checking out, what's the alternative? Where's the third option? The mythopoetic men's movement, those drum circle guys banging on about the wild man, that was cringe as hell and was never going to have broad appeal, and it's largely dead as a result. Male feminists have a bad track record of being predatory, ironically enough. Facts don't seem to matter in this fight. You can't convince someone that most men are good if they have decided that men as a whole are bad, and no amount of statistics seems able to convince them otherwise. People remain stubborn in their emotional positions on this stuff, and that is as frustrating here as it is in every other walk of life. Most men, the vast and overwhelming majority, are good people. But that fact doesn't seem to matter either. So, what the hell do we do? I mentor some men, various ages, though I don't think I'm particularly good at it or in much of a position to do so. I'm not a manly man. I can't give people a massive positive, and I struggle with my own issues around this and have mental and physical issues that I struggle with every single day, but just being someone for them to talk to seems to do a lot. I don't have the answers, but I can at least listen and offer some life experience based advice or guidance from having been at the sharp end. I don't have some grand vision of what masculinity should look like in the 21st century, but I at least try to talk to people and support them, and I'm often the only person in their lives that is. That's a lot of pressure, it's frustrating, and it's probably not very good for me. It's almost certainly destined for failure because it's just lil ol' me up against an entrenched anti-male societal bias that has developed on the one hand, and ruthlessly amoral exploitation of these same lost boys on the other. I've suffered from toxic stoicism myself, bottling things up, thinking I had to handle everything alone, and the way to deal with things was to ignore them and push it down. And that was the only form of traditional masculinity I felt that I could manifest, despite being otherwise an effete intellectual kid who was constantly being called gay. I've struggled with not being a conventional manly man. I've never liked sport, always liked reading and intellectual and artistic pursuits, stuff that gets you bullied in your school years, and that makes me an imperfect mentor. And I'm not willing to pretend to be perfect, as so many of these toxic gurus do. But maybe that's what young men need right now, someone who admits that they don't have all the answers, but who is willing to stand with them and try and figure it all out together. Perhaps we need to teach each other the process of becoming a man, of constructing and modifying our own paradigms, of knowing ourselves and our ethics, and channeling our energy in positive ways, as well as a bit of that emotional resilience that I took too far. But the Andrew Tates, etc. of this world offer something simpler, but wrong, but they offer it with absolute confidence. True, real things are more often grey, nuanced, and take effort, so it's little wonder that they tend to lose to brash, idiotic nonsense. And I also think we're failing to acknowledge the role of women in all this. It's an easy, bigoted thing to blame all men for everything, just as it's a lazy, bigoted way for far-right parties to blame immigrants for everything. Women hold an enormous amount of power over men, and if they want to see a positive change, I think a lot of that has to come from women, in the same way that a lot of the positive change for women had to come from men being willing to give up power and societal dominance in centuries past. Masculinity itself isn't inherently toxic or dangerous, just like femininity isn't inherently good or safe. Far from it. I think it's all about how we express it. But right now, men are being judged not as individuals, but as a collective burden, a whole, a mess, no matter how they happen to express their masculinity. The conversation around adolescence, which is where all of this started, believe it or not, is just another example of that lazy, broad brush approach. It's not revelatory, and people are taking the wrong lessons from it, using it as yet another stick to beat men and boys with. Men are struggling, not because they're weak, not because they're entitled, not because they're dangerous, but because the world has changed around them, become a lot more feminized. That's neither good nor bad in and of itself, but it does mean men have been left out and are maladapted to the society that we've rebuilt around them, without rebuilding them. It's the pendulum swinging the other way, and that's not justice or equality, that's revenge. That's just inverting. Nobody good has given men a new blueprint to follow, nor the freedom to find their own blueprint and be accepted as men, no matter what choices they happen to make, no matter which expression of masculinity they choose to embody. So maybe we all have to figure it out for ourselves. But that needs tolerance, acceptance, and an end to both the hatred and the argument that men today are responsible for the actions of men in the past. Collective blame. We need to end that. If we want a world where men don't turn to the likes of Tate and Peterson, we need to at least acknowledge the problem, begin to tackle it, and offer a positive alternative that actually appeals to men and that doesn't treat them as broken women, just as the left needs to offer a positive alternative vision to that the right is beating everyone over the head with. Because ignoring these issues won't make them go away, and so long as it doesn't go away, nor will people like Tate and Peterson. And censorship, which is the other thing that seems to be gaining in popularity around this, will only make things worse by making this stuff into forbidden fruit. Zang. Much digital ink and blood has been spilt talking about diversity representation in tabletop gaming, and in every other field of geek and nerd endeavour. Usually these conversations are extremely combative, and they tend to end poorly for everyone involved. I've been involved in these debates and discussions myself, to my detriment, the position I hold being that free expression and the vision of the author or creator should trump any and all other concerns, including diversity, representation, and so on. To my mind, the answer is for people to create according to their own conscience, not to be condemned out of hand, or for their motivations to be presumed, and for diversity of ideas to be the benchmark. I want a world in which Varg Vikernes and Olivia Hill can both make and sell the games that they want, and where I can ignore both of them. That said, I cannot help but be drawn to controversial topics. That is where the interesting conflicts and stories lie, and there are few topics so controversial as the treatment of minorities within media. Here we arrive at a nexus point, a conflict point, between realism, expectation, demands for representation, demands for free expression, historical revisionism, magic, science fiction, truth, is and ought. That makes it interesting. But the battle lines of identitarian politics, liberalism, conservatism, the regressive left and cultural libertarianism also make it an area fraught with difficulty and willful misunderstandings. There are no good, or at least no satisfactory, answers to a lot of these questions. Perhaps there are just multiple approaches, each of which will annoy some group or other. What's true in all circumstances, however, is that these controversial topics are interesting, fascinating, and important in terms of world, character, and scenario building, whatever your particular stance may be. This booklet intends to examine these issues in and of themselves, outside of the current state of controversy, and to ask, rather, how we might better simulate the plight of minority groups, understand them within the context of fictional worlds, make allowances for player characters who might seek to buck those societal trends, or to allow characters, through their actions, to affect social change within the game worlds. Available at post-mort.com and drive-thru RPG.